Did that work okay? Can everyone see this screen?
Yeah, we can see it just fine. Thanks, Michael.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and start. Introductions first, I guess. We drew straws, and I agreed to introduce myself. But my name is Michael Ingram. I've been with NREL about 6.5, going on 7 years. Work in a variety of roles here at the lab in interconnection, resilience, a little bit of water power, and of course, quite a bit of solar energy work with respect to DER integration and things like that. Before joining NREL, I was at a large utility in the Southeast United States. I worked there about 28 years in a variety of roles, including transmission, operations, engineering, and construction. I worked a little bit in R&D as well. With that, I'm going to jump into the presentation on transmission interconnection basics. So the typical phases of a project are these, and from your perspective, beginning the journey, I'll say, of developing a project for either wind or solar or other forms of renewable energy generation on the reservation. It involves these steps. The one I'm going to focus on, of course, is interconnection and transmission studies. Stepping back from interconnection per se, what is involved from a utilities perspective, which I have more experience with than interconnection. You probably have more experience with the interconnection processes than I do. You know, I've never tried to interconnect a wind turbine or a large solar farm per se. I've worked with independent power producers and interconnecting to my former utility, and have worked with utility commissions on this process, but I understand the basics. And so let's talk about the basics first. So building transmission, whether it's new transmission for the utility's purpose, new transmission upgrades that might affect the market or the system operations, or generation requests, new generation requests. It generally follows this process at a high level. So system planning studies feed into siting studies, and as you embark on those siting studies, there may be this pathway, this connection between points A and B won't work cost effectively, or there's not a route where the utility can obtain rights of way. So start over. The system study said we need power, we need new transmission between these two locations because of their studies. There may be an economic or commercial or an environmental constraint that cannot be effectively overcome, so they start over. If the siting studies identify a reasonable pathway, you move into this area of sequential efforts of trying to gain approval from the necessary areas, whether that's the state, in some areas that may be federal, and also in conjunction with designing the transmission, the physical connection, determining the requirements for the right-of-way, things like that, and the actual acquisition of the right-of-way property. Once all those are complete, we move into construction. Obviously, if the approvals fall through, then you start over again. And finally, after a considerable amount of time, the transmission system or the transmission line is put into operation, and it moves from this process to operations and maintenance, which is a whole nother process. The traditional process for transmission planning, again, utilities do this sort of work on a daily basis. And so the transmission service providers submit plans if there is a independent system operator on the requirements for transmission. The independent system operator reviews those plans in the context of the operational area and how it might affect the members, if you will, of that ISO. The Midwest ISO, the PJM is another, and there's several in California ISO. There's several in the country, but there are areas where system operators don't exist. They follow a similar process, but it's more internally facing. In some states, approved projects require state level approval, and the PUC, the Public Utility Commission or Public Service Commission, depending on the jurisdiction, may be involved in approving the route and whether the project is needed for the jurisdiction. Once a project is serviced, then once the approvals are provided, construction proceeds, not before. And once the project is certified and is operational, there is a return to the PUC or the rate making authority to allow for an adjustment to the recovery. What is involved in the system planning phase, the first phase in the system studies that might precipitate the need for more transmission? Well, the very most basic foundational study is load flow. And this is a cartoon, but it represents three areas in a transmission system or a system, an independent system operators area. Area A, Area B, and Area C. And there's a situation where Area A has less expensive power than Area B. So to facilitate that, the system operator does a study and allows for the transfer of power between A and B. Now, that's not as simple as just allowing the maximum transfer that the lines will allow because there are physical limitations on the line. If the line is overloaded, it has thermal limits. You can essentially melt the line with too much power. And so, and another physical characteristic that you may have heard of is called loop flows. And so some of the power may actually transmit from A to B through C. And that's because of the resistance and the impedance of the transmission line. Those flows can't necessarily be controlled to a certain level, but they happen because of the physics. But the operator will set a limit that doesn't seem intuitive, given that the physical limits of these lines, each of these lines is capable of 1,000 megawatts. But he sets a limit, or she sets a limit of just around 2,800 megawatts to allow that transfer and to maximize that benefit of the lower cost power from A to B. And why do they set it at a lower limit than 3,000? Well, they have to take into consideration what if they lose one of these transmission lines because of an electrical fault, a contingency is the technical word. And then the net transfers don't change, but the pathways change. And so they have to limit that contingency flow. You can't exceed 1,000 megawatts on that one line between A and C, or you would damage the infrastructure. It's kind of in the weeds, but just wanted to give you an example of what load flow is when it's discussed by the utility, or you see it described in the interconnection requests. So the next, kind of thinking about that high-level flow chart that I showed earlier, one of the next steps is transmission siting. So some of the first principles that I learned in transmission siting were these: avoid, minimize, and mitigate. So you want to avoid routing the transmission line through sensitive areas that have known environmental, scenic, recreational, cultural, or historical value, because of the difficulty of getting approval for those rights of way through those areas. Sometimes there isn't a better path, or there may already be a transmission line through an area like this that might be upgraded, that might carry a double circuit, a second transmission line through that existing right of way. But that's part of the first step, if you will, of transmission siting. Then the next step is to minimize those impacts by, like I said, employing existing corridors and trying to identify preferred areas that are away from residential zones, even commercial zones, of course, schools, and areas that, that might carry pushback in themselves. And finally, the last step is to mitigate the impacts through a variety of means, better pre-construction surveys, construction engineering, planning, and management, including O&M considerations. So if you can minimize the width of the right-of-way, the access to the right-of-way, limiting the number of roads for maintenance and construction, all those things are good with respect to the mitigation of the impacts on the transmission. Line basics. So once you move in past the siting, you're into the design. What goes into the design? Well, the design of the transmission line is, it must satisfy both the electrical requirements and the physical requirements. And where there might be extraordinary or extra aesthetic requirements, that's generally not, I'm an old transmission engineer, and I think lattice towers look good, but I'm probably in the minority. So, but if you're routing a transmission line through an area where there are pushback or there are concerns from the communities, you've seen these transmission towers that are different colors, that are allowed to naturally take on a patina or a rust color. Some of these sorts of things are incorporated into the design, where you may have monopoles instead of structures, H-frame or lattice tower, because they're visually easier on the eye, so to speak. The main elements of the overhead transmission are, of course, the conductor themselves, the structures, and the foundations. And all of those require sound engineering practice to go into. The conductor size is determined by the thermal and electrical capacity required, that was determined at the beginning in the studies. The losses associated with those, and that's a factor of the voltage that is being carried as well as the amount of power. There's a certain amount of resistance and impedance in those pathways in that transmission, and trying to minimize that by the design, the distances between the conductors and so forth. The structural design considers the physical loading, not only the weight of the conductors. So these conductors, you're looking at them from the ground. The extra high voltage, it can be as big as a soup can or a beer can, and it's not insignificant, the weight of that. It also has to take into consideration crosswind, and that is a design requirement that's kind of established by the National Electric Safety Code. What is the force, the maximum force that might be established on that cross conductor, and how that is carried by the structure. And finally, the foundation. After you determine the conductor size and the spacing and the structure that will best fit that corridor, what are the foundations associated with that monopole or that structure? That's important because it may require additional survey to understand how well that foundation needs to be designed. And finally, to kind of put this in context, like I said at the very beginning, this is part of the transmission planning process, and it is generally conducted for all access studies. So that's a generic term that includes the interconnection and generation. But requests for new transmission service, requests for elective or transmission expansion or upgrades, as well as the interconnection of generation. It's very similar across each of those. What goes into the engineering study, what goes into the design, it depends on why you're doing it and maybe who pays and what the queue looks like. We'll talk a little bit about those things. But generally, the studies that are performed to ensure that the reliability is maintained, that there's no adverse impact of the change to the system on the remainder of the system. And it consists, like I've talked a little bit about, on the thermal studies, the voltage and the stability, as well as short circuit analysis. The generation interconnection process, this is typical, but I used an example from the Southwest Power Pool. You enter the study process. Each of the green boxes is a financial obligation or a financial security. There's a cost involved with entering into this process. Generally, any action that the utility takes to support a generation interconnection is on a cost recoverable basis. They have to be reimbursed for that. Phase one is the feasibility study. It's kind of the lowest level. Is this feasible? And just at the very, very beginning, there's a decision point. Typically after this, if the feasibility could be borderline and it could infer that there will be an exceptional amount of cost associated with this interconnection, so there's an opportunity to withdraw. If you continue forward, there's an additional investment by the applicant, and system impact studies are undertaken. Finally, a second decision point, possibility of moving forward into the facility study. The facility study takes into account what upgrades, physical upgrades might be required to mitigate the system impacts that were identified. Typically before a utility will embark or allow an applicant to enter this process, they want proof of site control. That they're not just dealing with someone that is testing the system, so to speak, but that they have a genuine interest in the project. They have site control. They have ownership. They have a leasehold interest or a right to develop the site, or an option, a legal option to purchase, or some other exclusivity associated, including a business relationship and the right to possess and occupy the site. It's generally a critical path item in the process. Interconnection queue, I mentioned it briefly, but interconnection queue is essential for the utility to manage not only the line, so to speak, to the counter, to kind of use a grocery store or a pharmacy type of an analogy, but it also helps the utility to manage what they're studying as they move through this process. So they include those more mature applications in the study as they allow more people to enter the queue. So assuming there was a first applicant, that first applicant would have a fresh utility system for their interconnection. The second applicant would consider, their studies associated with the second applicant would include the transmission system plus any changes or impacts that the first applicant might have, and so on and so on and so on. That is one of the essential considerations of the queue. So what are the studies involved? And so diving a little deeper, sometimes it's not considered part of the study process, but the pre-application report, where it is available, is in kind of, in my opinion, part of the study process. It is pre-work that the utility has made available at anticipated interconnection hubs, and couldn't be available for a relatively low price to help the applicants better determine where to start their interconnection request. It may be a lower hanging fruit, so to speak, to connect to this substation than this substation, for example. The feasibility study is the first stage, and it's very initial. It's an initial analysis of the feasibility at the designated point. It can take a month and a half to complete, and there is, like I said, a cost associated with that. Moving beyond that, a more detailed process in the impact study, looking at engineering analysis for power flow, short circuit analysis, and that is if there is an electrical fault or a contingency on the system, how would the system behave if and when that new generation is connected. Stability analysis, that's a higher time frame or a narrower time frame, sub-second analysis that the utility may perform. Facility study takes into consideration these impacts. How might they be mitigated if they're discovered in the impact study? What physical equipment, transformer upgrades, transmission line upgrades, those sorts of things. And it may not just be between point A and point B. As I showed in the earlier diagram of the triangle system, there may be impacts in those loop areas as well. Facility study, talked a little bit about that. Preliminary study looks at a high level power flow and may look at short circuit analysis in some jurisdictions at some utilities. The system impact study looks at more information, more granular information on those studies to get a clear definition of that can provide the background for the facility study. That's an essential reason or the focus of the impact study. All of this, whether it's the feasibility study or the impact study, depends on all of the detail that you're asked to provide when you do the application. So some of that information may seem tedious, it may seem overly detailed, but all of that information is what is used in each of these studies that I've spoken about. The facility study determines, like I said, which equipment might be necessary to mitigate those impacts, but it also includes the cost, of course, of procuring the equipment, the engineering and the design associated with the new upgrades or the transmission line itself, and the procurement processes, and as well as the construction. And of course, all of that is loaded. There's overheads associated with that because it is assumed that the new generation doesn't have benefit to the utility that is providing the interconnection. And so all of those costs are on a reimbursable basis. Now, where that changes, there are exceptions to these rules, but that has to, that's a different process also. Environmental review, very important, but often considered outside or super to the interconnection request. But in most jurisdictions, the 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 environmental review, the environmental permitting is, thank you. The environmental permitting is in the critical path for the interconnection agreement. So you have to have the environmental review. It's often, well, not necessarily often, but sometimes it is not provided as part of the interconnection request by the utility. It is provided by a third party. But coming to the table with that in the process is essential. Some of the elements here, if you're not familiar with it, if the line or the facilities involved, substation, new substation, or connection point, are on federal property, then a NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act review is required, and there's levels associated with that. Certain state agencies also require an environmental review, even where it is on federal property, and especially if it's not. All of those have to be assembled, put together, and cleared to gain the environmental permit. Kind of getting the short rows. So interconnection risk mitigation strategies. In case you haven't gathered it by now, this is not for the weak at heart. This is not exactly the perfect slide, but it kind of provides the perspective that I'm hoping to provide. Is that, you know, of the most regulated industries in the United States, electric power generation, transmission, and distribution are near the top. This is not, like I said, not for the weak at heart. Even if you're a transmission owner, building new transmission, building new substations is difficult because of the regulations associated with safety, environment, community, and all these sorts of issues. I won't belabor that because I think some of you have experienced this more closely even than I have when I worked back at the utility. How can you make this easier? So one of the things that you can do is participate in the processes that your jurisdiction may have, where you are in a state, outside the reservation, to become knowledgeable of the individuals involved, the utilities that are involved, how that process operates, and become a stakeholder in that process. Attending, participating in public meetings for other projects, being aware of rulemaking associated that might affect a future project, and leveraging the organizations that you're involved with, such as this, other intertribal organizations and associations taking advantage of their potential leverage. Like I said, building those relationships and becoming more comfortable with the timelines and those folks that are knowledgeable and those processes. Helping to mitigate feasibility risk, consulting with the utility very early in the development process before the formal application is submitted to learn about preferred routes and pathways for projects, and what those deadlines are associated. While there is a generic process that I discussed, there are often different utility to utility, state to state. So learning those nuances with the individual utilities that you might be interconnecting with, a phone call is worth the investment. And again, I'll emphasize where available, and it's not common everywhere, even at the distribution level, which is a different topic. But those pre-application reports can be very valuable to help you with the planning and the decisions associated with the interconnection request. Cost risk mitigations. Again, the value of the pre-application report can offset or better prepare you for the sunk costs associated with some of those further studies. Undergrounding is often one of the first things that is mentioned in a community or in a stakeholder type meeting, but the costs associated with that can be very, very expensive, 4 to 7 times over overhead transmission. But in some cases, if it's balanced against maybe a go, no go type of decision through certain areas, there's not a alternative, it might make sense. It's unlikely to make sense for an entire transmission corridor, but it may make sense for a certain segment. Of course, there's costs associated with that transition from overhead to underground, but the economics may work out. Timeline risks mitigation. I've listed some here, but when executing a PPA, power purchase agreement, with the off-taker of your project, add in contingencies and associated with those so that they don't affect the interconnection process itself. Some interconnection processes with utilities require at some point the declaration or the show of those agreements for an off-taker, because the utility may or may not be the off-taker. There needs to be a customer that can cover that energy. There's a cluster process. I didn't really get into that, but some utilities will cluster, that is, group or aggregate like projects either in time or location and study them as a group. This, depending on who you ask, this is just different. It's just a different approach, but it's important to recognize when you're in that process that the discussions and understanding your relationships in that cluster and how it's working and how it's proceeding can be a little more, a little less clear. So involve yourself with the utility, make sure that they have all the information that they need from you with respect to your project and your destination and those kinds of things. Let's see, I'll go on to the next one. And I'm kind of getting in short rows, but one thing I want to bring up real quickly is a new IEEE standard. If you've heard me speak before about distribution level interconnection, there is a standard that IEEE dropped, released about 2 years ago, IEEE standard 1547. It describes the technical requirements for distribution level distributed energy resources. This very new standard only came out maybe a month ago, is IEEE standard 2800, and it's the standard for interconnecting inverter-based resources at the transmission level. It's been much anticipated. And the reason I want to bring it up is because there is beginning to have conversations at the industry level that it might be incorporated into the FERC LGIP, the large generator interconnection process, and or the small generation interconnection process that FERC, that many utilities begin their process as the foundation. If it is adopted, or if parts of it are adopted, it could eventually have an impact. So I'm going to page through these. If you're familiar with the FERC process, it's not long on some of the technical details, I'll say. 2800 firms that up and provides a standard basis that would take some of the decisions, some of the concerns, some of the screens, it may reduce them because the equipment itself will have these requirements baked into them. And so that makes the equipment a better grid citizen, so to speak. The standard is deep and is very technical. It's principally written for the manufacturer. It's requirements that the manufacturer must meet in each of these areas to satisfy the modern requirements of the grid. That's a good thing. There are some decisions in this in the standard that the utility and possibly the developer will have to make some settings, some knobs and dials, if you will, that will need to be modified when the connection is made. But again, largely that will be on the utilities table when they do the studies. They may identify some opportunities for the resource to adapt to the system as opposed to the system adopting to the resource. So you may be able to change some of the settings of the equipment to react better to what's going on in the system. Apologize for all of this, but one of the areas that is a gap right now, especially from the utility perspective, is what is the model of your system? The parameters of that, the depth of that, the ability of the utility to take that model, that mathematical representation of how it will react to a system event, and pull it into their software to study is a gap. It's been a research area for a number of years, but one of the outcomes associated with this new standard 2800 is moving that process forward, making it a standard development so that when you take the inverter out of the box, so to speak, there is a model and it is described, the parameters of it, the character of it, if you will, is described by the standard, and it makes it more of a simplified process for the utility to use, which ultimately will reduce your cost and streamline the process of interconnection. You know, once this process is incorporated into the utility processes. That's the end of my presentation. Let's see if I can stop sharing. Or...
Thanks, Michael. That was great. Now, I hate to do this, but there is a tribal DOE consultation right now that people might want to be heading to. Let me see, Carrie, is there time for Michael to answer a question or two, or should we could give my email or Michael's email and people can ask questions that way later?
That'd be fine.
Yeah, that would be fine in case anybody wants to jump off and head to the consultation. I'm also going to quickly put up a poll here if anybody has time to quick answer that.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm putting my email in the chat to everyone who's still on. And Gary and Bartek, I did take note of your questions, and we will, I will email you at some point. Thanks.
Apologies, Laura, for going long.
That's okay. Thank you so much for your time. Carrie, I don't see poll questions, but if the participants want to head on over to that tribal consultation, that would be great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Laura and Michael.
Thank you, Carrie. Bye-bye.